Welcome to our second unit in the Science and Ethics module, and in this one we're going to be looking at contemporary issues in science education. So here's the key question here for you. Why is it important to understand issues such as cloning, global warming, genetic modification and so on? So these are the sorts of things we hear about in the media. How do we relate those issues to what we actually teach in our curriculum as well, which tends to be more focused on understanding the concepts behind these issues? Why is it important for us, especially as teachers? So the integration of contemporary issues into science lessons, whether that be in a primary context or in a junior secondary, clearly depending on the sort of content, provides a powerful context for the discussion of associated ethical issues. So there are many examples of contemporary issues from the major scientific disciplines, some of which I've listed below. So clearly a lot of these, we don't tend to go into the associated concepts in the primary years, but we can still discuss some of the ethical issues that are involved with these contexts. So physics, particularly in junior secondary, we can go into a lot of interesting topics related to the nuclear energy issues, using nuclear power, the use of the technologies for nuclear weapons. We can look at things like radioactive dating, radiation exposure. Something that's quite topical is the non-renewable energy sources like wind farms and things like that. Energy conservation and energy use. Chemistry, lots of associated issues. So sort of the use of chemicals, or especially industrial type chemicals or agricultural pesticides, how we dispose of them, how we use them, their influence on our health. Ozone depletion, which was very topical a little while ago, not so topical now. Global warming, which is sometimes described as climate change, which tends to be a much more politically correct term because the use of the term global warming implies that we have taken a side on it and we have decided that the Earth is warming. Anyway, we're going to go into that in quite a bit more detail a bit later on. Drought, acid rain, using rainwater tanks, problems with soil salinity, irrigation issues. And then in our biology domain, we have lots of issues. And a lot of the biology ones can be quite emotive because clearly we as humans, the issues relate directly to us. So things like euthanasia, which is the voluntary taking of life, stem cell research, genetic modification, cloning, all those types of things people relate to on a personal level. So they tend to bring in a lot more of those emotive issues as well. So some examples of contemporary issues. Now, I'm going to talk about two examples. And this rapidly developing field of bioengineering. It's sort of an integration of biology and engineering. So including the application of the powerful techniques or engineering techniques associated with modern genetics research, which is a field of biology. So you may have heard of this Human Genome Project where we've attempted to map the entire gene sequence of humans as well as a number of other organisms. And it's interesting, some of the findings from this project, which was a very collaborative project across many countries in the world, actually found that much of our gene sequencing actually aligns very closely with many organisms, including some insects. So it's actually been really interesting to see how much of our genetics we share with organisms we probably didn't think we would. So there's lots of controversial sort of issues though associated with this work. And a lot of it makes sort of front page news with the media because again it's that sort of relatedness to ourselves that the media can really sell. So questions such as the following: should society condone or even encourage the cloning of animals and even perhaps human beings? Because much of this work can sort of underpin these future uses of it. Should prospective parents be able to buy embryos with specific genetic pedigrees for implantation? So should we be able to pick and choose? So that whole idea of designer babies. Should an individual's genetic code be kept on file by the government? And if so, to whom it should be available? This one raises a lot of issues because they're sort of saying, are there genetics for people that engage in crime, criminal behaviours? Are there particular markers in their genes where we can say, well, we're going to screen everybody, and then if we find that that particular marker is there, do we put people in a category, when they're infants, to say, well, this person's going to be prone to being a criminal? It's that kind of use of the science which is quite controversial. Genetically modified organisms, or you might remember it as genetically modified foods, because when this field first began, there was very much a focus on edible foods or crops, but now the field has really broadened to include organisms. So it can be animals, it can be plants. So GMOs are organisms whose genetic material, that's basically the blueprint in your cells, have been altered using different types of engineering techniques. So organisms that have been genetically modified include a whole range of things, right from our microorganisms like bacteria and yeasts, through to insects, plants, fish, and mammals. So GMOs are the source of genetically modified foods, and they're also widely used in scientific research and to produce goods other than food. So why do we do it? I mean, most people think negatively about genetic modification. We're going to look at both sides of the story, but basically the idea behind it was that sort of stemmed this whole field was agriculture. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to start altering our crops so that we could increase the chances of crops having desirable traits such as resistance to pests, herbicides, being able to withstand harsh environmental conditions like drought or too much rain or too little rain, not having the right nutrients in the soil. We want to make sure that our crops had an improved product shelf life. What that means is, again, lots of economic factors here, is that the big chains like our Coles and our Woolworths, they want to have apples in there that they can put on their shelf and know that they're going to last for months. And some of those apples are actually kept in storage for up to a year. And we're still able to consume them safely. So there's really some really interesting facts there. There's also good things like the golden rice, which was a crop that was genetically engineered to increase the vitamin content in it for people in countries where they were lacking in nutrition. And also it's used to produce goods such as drugs, and again, valuable goods such as drugs. Well, we do know some drugs are valuable and some may not be. However, a large and growing body of scientific and other authoritative evidence have questioned these claims. So let's have a little look here at a link about GMOs, which points out some of the limitations.
Genetically engineered crops in agriculture, a worldwide experiment on people, animals, and nature. Cultivation of genetically engineered crops like soy, maize, cotton, or canola have far-reaching consequences. 90% of genetically engineered crops belong to the corporate agricultural group Monsanto. The rest are owned by Syngenta, DuPont, Bayer, and others. Genetic manipulation of crops can have uncontrollable consequences. The function of genomes is only partially understood, but foreign genes are still introduced into crops. These genetically engineered crops are widely cultivated outdoors, where they cannot be controlled. Currently, 90% of GE cultivation occurs in the Americas, particularly in the USA, Argentina, Brazil, and Canada. It seems researchers have forgotten that genetically engineered crops once outside can no longer be controlled like they could in the lab. GE crops can self-replicate and pass on their new characteristics to neighboring crops, penetrating the fields of farmers who want to cultivate their crops without genetic engineering. Adverts from the genetic engineering lobby claim genetically engineered crops produce higher yields, but this marketing mantra is a complete hoax. It has been shown that crop yields for GE crops are no higher than normal crops, but farmers must buy more expensive patented genetically engineered seeds each year. This forces them to become dependent on corporate giants. But that's not all. Genetic engineering giants also produce pesticides and herbicides. There are two characteristic traits of genetically engineered crops. They are either resistant to herbicides, in which case the genetic engineering company itself produces the suitable herbicide, or the genetically engineered crop emits an insecticide. Whether or not the crops are resistant to weed killer or give off poisonous gases, not only weeds or pests are eliminated, other beneficial field growth and some living creatures are killed as well. But nature adapts, so pests and weeds develop resistance to pesticides. And that means that increasing amounts of stronger pesticides will be used. Especially grave consequences are observed in this respect in monocultures. For example, in South America, rainforests and other natural landscapes are destroyed every day to make room for genetically engineered monocultures and pasture. At the same time, the soil and groundwater are poisoned. On top of that, the genetic engineering lobby claims genetically engineered crops can help to reduce world hunger. Genetic engineering is not the answer. There is enough food on Earth. The problem is that it's not distributed fairly. But the fact is that most genetically engineered crops find their way into the livestock chain, so they end up as meat or dairy products in supermarkets. Along with all the destructive effects on the environment, one last awkward question remains. How do genetically engineered crops affect humans and animals? The answer is, no one knows. Therefore, it's important for you to carefully consider which products you buy. Get informed and get involved, because our world is not a testing ground. For more information about genetic engineering, go to greenpeace.org/GMO.
So I hope you enjoyed watching that clip. I'm not sure if enjoy is the right word. I find it was produced by Greenpeace, and again, Greenpeace do have a particular agenda. They're fairly, we could say neutral, environmentally pro-environmental group, but they do have a fairly sound research in that they're not funded by particular companies. But really, I find that clip so powerful to see the ramifications from genetically modified organisms and crops and the influence it can have. We're quite lucky in Australia in that, and again, if you travel to the US, which I do every year for conferences over there for my own research, is that, the vast majority of grain products that you consume in the US are genetically modified. That's just a fact. And here we have quite good labeling laws, but we are able to check labels to see if genetically modified organisms are contained in our food products. But it is something to really think about, and to think about the possible consequences of that long term, and also the effects of that into our animal products as well. So critics of GMOs claim they're laboratory made using technology that is totally different from natural breeding methods and pose different risks from non-GM crops, that they can be toxic, allergenic, or less nutritious than their natural counterparts, that they're not adequately regulated to ensure safety, that they do not increase yield potential. And that's a really interesting one, because really that was the key promotion by the GM manufacturers, is that the farmers would have, higher yields in their crops. They do not reduce pesticide use, but actually increase it. And again, that whole idea of building up a resistance, it's actually a similar argument to the antibiotic movement, where over time research has found that increased use of antibiotics actually then doesn't actually help us, because the particular bacterias that the antibiotics are actually supposed to fight will end up over time building up a resistance to the different antibiotics we're using. They have mixed economic effects. They're not always positive. They can harm the soil quality, disrupt ecosystems, and reduce biodiversity. Now, the biodiversity is a really major issue, particularly in South America, where we have some of the world's most unique organisms that are basically becoming extinct, because we're clearing such large areas of land to produce what we call these monocultures, or one type. Monoculture means a one type of crop, so it's just corn, or it's soy, or it's maize. So this loss of biodiversity is a big issue. They don't offer effective solutions to climate change. They're just as energy hungry as any other type of chemically farmed crop. And they cannot solve the problem of world hunger. So really, they're actually quite a distraction from that real issue, in that problems with poverty in developing countries are not based on a lack of available food sources. They are due to inequities with how money decisions are made. So if you do any sort of history or you've looked into any of those issues, it's actually more political and economic factors that contribute to world hunger than it is actual access to the food. So that's an issue that you can easily bring up and discuss in a safe way in a school setting. The next one I think is really interesting, particularly for us as adult learners, and it's looking at stem cells. So it's coming more from the biology domain. And I certainly probably would not advise you to bring this one up, of this particular scenario in particular, in a primary setting. In fact, even in a junior secondary setting, it could be a little, I'm not going to say, it could be, it's quite emotive, but it requires a certain level of maturity for students to actually engage in conversations about it. So certainly in the year 11, 12 biology, you could bring it up, but I'd like to include this one for your own understanding. So we're going to look at stem cells. And basically in the last decade, research has opened the doors to fetal tissue transplantation. And what that is, it's a procedure that typically involves transferring tissue from an aborted fetus to another human. So what that means is that when we say aborted, we mean that it can be aborted by medical means. In other words, that the doctors can provide some drugs that bring on a premature labour, and the fetus is actually produced for that reason. It's not a natural abortion which can occur, which is not able to be stopped. And the reason for that is that what scientists have found is that the fetal tissue contains stem cells, which are a special kind of cell that are not what we call a non-differentiated cell. And what that means is that we can actually cultivate these cells and grow them into any kind of tissue that we want. Brain cell, nerve cell, skin cell. So basically it's providing this, what they call sort of ingredient to be able to grow other types of tissue. So a fetus is unique in that it can provide that kind of tissue. So this procedure could potentially provide therapy for victims of a variety of debilitating diseases, including diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease. So as in many areas of biotechnology, the development of this technique has outpaced the development of ethical policy. So really this one is, and this is the main reason I'm bringing up, it's fraught with ethical issues. So I'm going to show you a small clip which highlights some of the religious issues associated with this, because of course it's interfering with human life, isn't it? So let's have a look.
The status of humanity and human life has been the subject of thought and debate and discussion for millennia, really. Our philosophical approaches owe a lot to Aristotle and Aquinas, and they recognised that there was something special about the human being, but they weren't sure when that specialness or when the personhood came into being.
Few would deny the potential for medical research from research into embryonic and adult stem cells. But the big ethical question is, should we be using embryos to do this? What is the moral status of the early human embryo? Is it fully a person or what?
The Catholic Church, when it looks at embryonic stem cell research, sees really the same issues in place as there are in abortion. It's all about when life begins and what protection we offer to all human beings. We can never set aside a subset of humanity and say they are not deserving of protection.
The Islamic perspectives of the status of the embryo, I would think we could recognize 4 different stages. Firstly, the embryo outside the womb, the embryo when it's implanted into the womb, then a gestation of 6 to 8 weeks when the fetus is fully formed, and finally, most importantly, is 120 days after conception when ensoulment takes place, and that is a very important milestone.
For some people, the early embryo has no status, and it is a matter of duty that you should be doing the research in order to save human life. The scales weigh very heavily on one side. The opposite position is that, in a sense, there is no balance at all, because you cannot do research on what is seen as being a human being. In between these two, there is a question of balance. How far would you be justified in destroying what could be a human being if you created the right conditions for the embryo to be implanted, but you nonetheless decide to do research on it instead? What justifies research?
Well, I hope you found that interesting. I think it's just, I find it so interesting. So that's why I love doing this course. I think it forces us to really consider things that we don't bother thinking about, and they're really important issues. And for our students, this is the kind of stuff that is important to them as being to be educated, is to be able to consider important issues and be able to critically evaluate them and form ideas that are based on an educated viewpoint, not based just on an emotive or a personal, opinion. So I want you to read the scenario on the following slide, just on the basis of that. And I really like that clip because it gives a number of different perspectives. It gives a couple of those early ones of the Catholic and Islam view on the status of an embryo and when does it become a person, when is it considered to be a human life, and the other one more from a medical point of view as to, well, here are the helpful components of using embryos for this type of stem cell research. But then again, it balances it with, how do we decide? Okay, so I'm going to read this out, or you can read it yourself. So Bill, this is just a fictional scenario. Bill and Sally are a happily married couple in their late 30s. They enjoy a comfortable lifestyle and a stable home life with their 2 teenage children. Recently, Sally's elderly father was diagnosed as having Parkinson's disease, a slowly progressive disabling ailment marked by tremor and increasing muscular stiffness. His symptoms are mild, but his physician has explained that he will become more and more incapacitated with time. Close to the time that she learns about her father, Sally reads an article in the local newspaper about a research project being run at a local university. A team of researchers led by Dr. Harrison have applied to the federal and state governments for permission to do a study with Parkinson's victims. She visits Dr. Harrison to learn more about the disease. During the course of their discussions, she finds out that the progression of Parkinson's can be slowed and possibly reversed by implanting fetal brain cells in the brain of the patient. 2 months later, Sally is surprised to learn that she has become pregnant. Because of the unexpected nature of the pregnancy, Sally considers aborting the fetus. Furthermore, as her father's condition begins to deteriorate, she and Bill consider some therapeutic options for him. Recalling her discussions with Dr. Harrison, Sally and Bill begin to discuss the option of using tissue from the fetus in her womb to donate the cells to cure her father. So here's the activity for you. Now, I've also included a reading on stem cells, some sort of background about what they are and the different types. So it's really important for you to read through that because, again, like I said, when you're making decisions to do with science-related issues, obviously ethical issues as well, if we want to make them as informed citizens, we need to have some understanding of the science behind the issue, plus our own views about what constitutes life, and some understanding of ethics, which we've done in this module, before we make our decisions. So that's what I mean about making evidence-based decisions. So we know a little bit about the science, we know a bit about ethics, and then we can make a better judgment. So if you have a read through that stem cell article first, and then think about these questions. Should Sally be able to decide whether she can abort her unborn baby? So should Sally have that decision? Does the new unborn baby have rights? If so, what are they? And what are the possible implications of this decision if Sally goes ahead with the abortion? So I'd like you to share your views on the discussion board to any or all of those questions and really think about the science behind the issue, but also the religious and moral implications.